in its simplest and bluntest terms, is that even nations that are friends are bound to have disputes. If those disputes are not settled by negotiation, the only alternative left is to settle them either by force or by law. At a time when the use of force means unleashing nuclear weapons which would destroy civilization, all sensible people agree that we must find some alternative to force for settling international disputes. Now that's really an incredible statement, because in passing we should keep in mind that law also is force. If the courts don't have the police and the armies to back up their decisions with force if necessary, then there's no law. Law is force, legalized. And so, with this reality in mind, Mr. Nixon's statement continues. There are some today who believe that the prospect of the use of atomic weapons to settle international disputes is so terrible that we should set up a new all-powerful world organization which would have jurisdiction over disputes between nations. I disagree with this approach. I believe that rather than setting up a new international institution, we have to begin to use the one we already have. And then Vice President Nixon continues in his statement and concludes with strong assurances that we have nothing to fear and much to gain by repealing the Connolly Amendment. The international institution we already have, of course, is the United Nations. Most Americans good-heartedly accept the UN as a kind of farcical debating society. But I can assure you that the grand designers have other thoughts and plans. The May 1964 issue of the official UN Monthly Chronicle contains these glimpses into the future through the eyes of Secretary General U Thant. If we are to make the next step toward world authority and then onward to world government, it will be by the growth in authority and prestige of the United Nations and the International Court. Some form of regulatory international machinery of government in the true sense of the word is required. Such an authority cannot merely consist in a paper constitution and must be based in a certain degree of power. Well, a certain degree of power doesn't sound very menacing, but just how much power would it take to make the vision of a world government come true? Well, obviously, it would take whatever amount is required to be superior to that of any political subdivision beneath it. It would have to be so powerful that no nation could be able to challenge it without risking nuclear annihilation at the hands of the UN Army. But of course, if that happened, no one could possibly object, because it wouldn't be called an act of war. It would be a peacekeeping maneuver by a peacekeeping force, and the mushroom cloud would rise from a peacekeeping bomb. Now, I know this must sound fantastic to some of you, so let's get back to the record. In 1961, the State Department published Document 7277, a booklet entitled Freedom from War, and the subtitle explains what it really is: the United States Program for General and Complete Disarmament in a Peaceful World. Now, this was our proposal submitted to the General Assembly of the United Nations for disarming and transferring to the UN complete control over our atomic weapons, our missiles, and our national Army, Navy, and Air Force as well. Everything except what we might need for a limited internal police function. Now, after 18 pages of detailed proposals, we finally discover in plain language the ultimate goal of our disarmament program. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is a direct quote. Disarmament would proceed to a point where no state would have the military power to challenge the progressively strengthened UN peace force. Well, of course, 1961 was a long time ago. And it's true that State Department publication 7277 is no longer our official position on disarmament. It was replaced by this one, Arms Control and Disarmament Agency publication, number 4, General Series 3, and as you can see, it's entitled Blueprint for the Peace Race. On page 33, we find the new position. The parties to the treaty would progressively strengthen the United Nations Peace Force established in Stage 2 until it had sufficient armed forces and armaments so that no state could challenge it. And so it has gone, year after year, revision after revision. The basic objective of our disarmament proposals has been and is today the objective of the grand design, the creation of a true world government with sufficient military force to compel all nations, including our own, to obey. The January-February issue of Vista magazine, published by the United Nations Association, featured an exclusive interview with former President Eisenhower dealing with exactly this subject. The reporter, Mary Kersey Harvey, a senior editor of McCall's magazine, wanted to get the President's reaction to a proposal by Grenville Clark, which would establish a permanent UN World Army. After outlining the Clark proposal for President Eisenhower, here is what Miss Harvey reported. The President studied the above plan quickly, and, as I had expected, caught the ball and began to run with it. You'd have, he began to plan out loud, world marshals comparable to our U.S. marshals backed by armed forces. Non-compliance with UN law, and you send in the UN forces. He orchestrated this point at some length. And, too, he hammered away, the UN needs nuclear power. He bore down hard on the word nuclear. Take this example, he hurried on. You have two countries in a border argument. The UN orders the matter to be taken to the International Court. One or both of the disputants refuses to submit to compulsory arbitration. The UN, which by now has in its possession a fleet of submarines armed with nuclear warheads deployed around the world, orders one of the submarines to proceed to the area. The world is then told that if firing breaks out for any reason whatsoever, a tactical nuclear weapon will be delivered onto the disputed territory. If this threat fails to prevent armed conflict, you back it up with action. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the grand design for preventing nuclear war. Well, that's all the quotations and exhibits that time permits, which is in a way unfortunate because the examples I've used so far have been slightly top-heavy with Republicans. If I had more time, I could balance it out and then get everybody mad at me. But seriously, ladies and gentlemen, it's just as easy to find the sentiments expressed here within the top ranks of one major party as it is the other. The grand design has absolutely nothing to do with partisan politics. These men aren't nearly as much Republicans or Democrats as they are world politicians. They've got bigger things to occupy their minds than mere party labels. To them, partisan politics is only a game to amuse the masses who crave the showmanship of big national conventions, the excitement of partisan campaigns, and the satisfaction of casting a vote in the illusion that somehow they're really helping to decide the important issues of the day. But with precious few exceptions, for the past 2 decades, the American voter has had to make his choice between Grand Designer A and Grand Designer B. It's always a source of amazement to me when I hear someone criticize our leaders for being confused in the area of foreign policy, of reversing their position, of bungling the job and not having any long-range goals. These men are not bungling the job. They're acting in accordance with a definite, well-thought-out plan, and they've been executing that plan with brilliant precision. We may or may not like the plan, but let's not kid ourselves into thinking that there isn't any. Now, I, for one, don't like the plan, and you may wonder why not. As you recall, earlier I said that when I was first exposed to the grand design, it seemed like a compelling argument. After all, each of these steps do seem to progress logically, one to the other. So, having taken this much time merely to expound and explain a point of view which I no longer accept, I think the least I can do now is to offer the reasons for having changed my mind and to expose what I consider to be the fatal flaws